In this video, I'm going to turn this habitat vivarium into an amazing miniature jungle for the most poisonous amphibian on the planet. Make sure you stay to the end of the video as I'll show you these amazing animals that are going into this vivarium. For this build, I want you to have lots of branches and cork to make it sort of look like the bottom of a jungle floor with some fallen branches, and to give the deadly amphibian that's going into this more height to climb. I started off by placing some cork branches together to see what it would look like. I want the cork to be the main centerpieces of this build, like I said. Once I was happy with that, I then glued the pieces together. I used Gorilla Wood Glue and put them together, and then used water to activate the glue. A few hours later, and it wasn't really holding up the best, so I ended up using expanding foam plus the glue to hold it together, and actually this worked out a lot better. You can see that it has a pretty strong bond as well. After that, I then cut off the excess expanding foam to clean it up a little bit. Once I cut off the expanding foam, I then plopped it back in the vivarium and took a step back to see what it looks like. Overall, I was happy with this. I then started to put some cork into the vivarium and work on the placements. I ended up really liking this cork panel in the back left of the tank. It sort of looks like a small tree trunk. And I liked the other branch coming down from the cork panel, but I didn't like it because it didn't look super natural, so I ended up changing it a little bit. Not only did this look better, but again would create easier climbing opportunities for the amphibians going in. I really wanted to use more wood, but I couldn't really get this branch to work in this build at all. No matter what I did, it just looked out of place and just didn't work. Sometimes less is more. I then added some spiderwood to create roots on the tree trunk and give it more detail. To attach the spiderwood to the cork, I just used some expanding foam and glue on certain parts, and also attached the big cork branch onto the cork tree trunk so it's more secure and just looks a bit better. Once I was happy with the wood that was going into the vivarium, I then got to work on the background. For the background, I'm just using some Sodal expanding foam. I'm not really bothered that I'm using the white version, because we end up using about 3 cans of silicone to cover it all up later anyway. For the back right of the vivarium here, you can see that I add a lot more expanding foam in this certain section. You'll see why I do this soon. I also added no cork bark straight into the expanding foam as it was like setting and curing. It usually takes the depth away from the cork because the cork ends up like going into the expanding foam because the expanding foam is foaming around the cork. "24 hours later, I then put the cork panel and branch back in the vivarium to see how much I needed to cut off of the foam so that the cork can go into the background instead of sticking out so much. After that, it was time to cut. The reason why we cut the expanding foam is so that the silicone can then be stuck onto the foam easier and won't come off. If you didn't cut the expanding foam, there would be nowhere for the silicone to stick. It does take a while, but in the end, it's definitely worth it. Remember when I said I added more spray foam to the back right of the tank? This is why. I wanted to make a mini cave or a little ledge for them to hang out inside. Looking back, I wish I made it a bit bigger and a little bit more natural, but either way, it does turn out pretty cool. To get the cave look that I wanted, I added pieces of slate around it and inside it. I got some nice big chunky bits with some nice texture on them. We put the tank on its back and started to place out where we wanted the rocks to sit. This took a little while to get right, as I wanted it to look as natural as possible. In the end, I think it turned out good. Once we were happy with the placements of the rocks, it was time to stick them down with some expanding foam. You just need a small amount, as remember, this will expand quite a lot. For the mini ledge, I wanted to make it look a little more natural. I added some thin bits of spiderwood around it to make it look like roots trying to come out from the side. I know it doesn't look like much now, but it just adds that extra level of realism that it's missing. Once I added the spiderwood, it was time to silicone the expanding foam. I'm just using 100% aquarium grade brown silicone. I don't want to get any silicone on top of the rocks, so right here we're being really careful to make sure that we take our time and not get any on the rocks. I'm using this tree fern fibre on top of the silicone to create a more natural look to the background. This stuff is really cool. It has little bits of fern sticks that stick out, adding to the realism of it all. And I highly recommend using this as your background. To spread out the silicone, we used an old knife that we now use for silicone and made sure to cover all the white expanding foam between the rocks. A little tip if you're using expanding foam in silicone is to make sure that the silicone is around the edge of the expanding foam, so that it not only creates a seal, but it also makes sure the expanding foam stays on the glass. Here we're just putting clumps of tree fern fibre into the silicone, making sure there's loads stuck to it, as a fair amount will fall off once the build is upright. 1 week later, the background was finally done. We left the silicone around a week to make sure it cured properly before adding any plants or life into it. If you don't wait 1 to 2 weeks for the silicone to cure, it can give off ammonia, which will kill the plants and the life inside the vivarium. I also added this little bit of cork bark to the back as well. Next, it was time to add the drainage layer. For the drainage layer, I'm using aquarium foam that you can get pretty cheap from anywhere. This is a lot lighter than using clay balls, as my old tank I used clay balls for the drainage layer and it became almost impossible to lift. This was not only less money, but just overall easier to manage. I struggled a little bit trying to get the foam into the left side of the vivarium because the spiderwood being at the same level, but we eventually got there. For the substrate barrier, I'm just using cheap substrate barrier you can get online from a reptile store, or you can use window screen mesh. This stuff is also super annoying to put in. Once I added the barrier, it was time to put the cork branches I stuck together back into the tank. For the substrate, I'm using Pro Rep Forest. I use this in all my builds at the moment as it has good drainage and has loads of benefits for the plants and life going into this. We use around 2 bags to fill the tanks, so I think it's around 20 litres it adds up to. You can see it has bits of sphagnum moss, charcoal, wood and dirt all mixed together. It's a perfect substrate that I really do recommend you try out. Once the substrate was finished, this is what it was looking like. Overall, I was actually super happy with how everything came together. I just wish I had some bigger bits of cork branches so that I could eventually put more moss on it, but either way, I was happy with it. It was now time to plant the tank. For the first plant, I'm using Monstera dubia. This is a climbing plant and I've always wanted to use this in a build, but wanted to wait until I had enough space. It attaches itself to whatever you put it on and just looks amazing. We played about with the placement and decided to put it on the further away branch, but we can take a clipping eventually and place it around the tank if we need to. Over time, the Monstera will attach itself to the cork and slowly grow up it. I then use some peacock moss, as once this plant grows and gets light, it can actually have a blue tint around the edges of the plant and it looks really cool. Next, it was another Monstera plant, but this time it was a monkey mask. I've used this plant in my green tree frog tank and it's growing extremely well. It's a very cheap and easy plant to have, but also looks pretty good. Next is the dwarf umbrella tree. I got these plants a while back, so if I get any of these plants wrong, please correct me in the comments. This plant just reminds me of the Chinese money plant, but bushier. Next is another favourite of mine, is the Margravia umbellata red. This plant is pretty rare in the hobby, and it will also eventually climb its way up. The next two plants, I'm not 100% sure what they are, but I've made the best attempts as I got them from somewhere a while back. These two plants we will plant in the tree trunk and we'll make them vine down the court. This dragon tree plant looked really cool, so I just picked it up and wanted to see how it would fit into the tank. I think it looks pretty cool and they're super easy to care for as well. The polka dot begonia is another plant that I had in my green tree frog tank and grew extremely well. This plant is super interesting and not like many other out there. The next plant is Moon Valley Clearweed. I really like the texture on this plant and I've seen it used in the hobby before. Parsley fern is just your typical looking fern, but I did like the look of it, so I thought I'd include it into the build. Next is a corn plant, which is the same family as the dragon tree plant. Again, I just like the look of it. For the bromelaid, I wanted to have a big centerpiece plant, so this was a perfect plant for that. I'm using another polka dot plant, but this time they're a much cheaper version, but still really cool looking. There's loads of colours of this plant specifically, but I went for the pink dot and the white and green dot ones. As I'm showing the pink polka dot plant, you can also see the peacock mask in the background already has that blue tint on the edge of it. I just love the detail of that plant. I put the bromelaid up in the corner as this plant can't be put into soil and it has to have its roots exposed, plus it looks really nice up there. Next, it was time to add some weeping moss. I put loads of the moss onto the big branch at the front as I want to eventually carpet the whole cork branch. I also added it around the slate in the back. After I planted everything, I give the tank a full spray down so the plants don't dry out, and also to give the tank its first proper watering. I made sure to water the moss a lot, as moss can very easily dry out and die. The next thing in the tank was to add some rocks. The rocks I'm using are grey mountain stones. They look really simple but have a good level of texture and detail on them. My plan was to create climbing opportunities into the ledge that we made, just making it easier for them. I do wish I put some more at the front though, because I do love the look of these rocks. After that, it was time for some leaf litter. For the leaf litter, I'm just using Pro Rep, but you can really use any type of leaf litter you want. I just go with what I've used in the past. Putting leaf litter in the tank will stop the substrate from sticking to the amphibian and also create little dens. I then added some springtails to the tank. I have no idea why I added them after I put the leaf litter down, but it is what it is. Springtails will help break down any waste from the amphibians and turn it into food for the plants. They will also eat mold, which most tanks will get going through the cycling phase. With the plants added to the vivarium, it was pretty much done. Overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out, but it's missing one thing, the deadly amphibian. We're going to be adding 3 poison dart frogs into this tank, specifically Dendrobate leucomelas. These frogs are extremely deadly in the wild, as it gets its skin toxins from the diet they have, this being ants. In captivity, however, they're not toxic at all, as long as they are captive bred. I think they look amazing in this tank because of the bright yellow colours against the brown and greens. I made this tank with loads of climbing opportunities as this specific species loves to climb. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more future builds. I have a lot planned and already some new tanks done, so I can't wait to show you guys what we've been cooking up.